Okay, let's start. Welcome to the Hub Politics Lab, our third year running. And as you can see here, our hybrid room, our offline room is slowly gathering more and more people here. And I can see online, we also have 21 and counting participants. So it's really good to see so many people joining in today. We have a really exciting talk. Henk van der Kolk is our guest today from the University of Twente and presenting work with Matthijs Roda and Armen Akverdian and André Zaslov. And as part of our tradition, I'm receiving messages from Matthijs that he can't enter, I think. That's always happening. Okay, I'll try to fix that. Okay, so Henk will talk about feelings of political discontent. Henk is an associate professor at the University of Twente. I'm not sure which department anymore because it used to be political science and public administration, but today...
Long time ago, yeah.
Long time ago, okay, yeah. Henk, yeah, for me, you're really one of those infamous people in the Netherlands who collect all these huge amounts of data that we sometimes use, and so we're very grateful for that. And I think this will also be part of one of those big public data collections that you often work on. And so I'm really excited about this topic. And for those people who have joined us for the first time today, Henk will talk for about 20 minutes. Then you have your opportunity to ask questions, both here in the room. You're also allowed to ask a question. And if you're online, you can type your question into the Q&A box. And Bert Bakker, who's co-hosting with me today, will moderate that conversation. So without further ado, I'll yield the virtual space to you, Henk.
Thank you. Indeed, I'm very glad that I'm able to talk to some political scientists again, because I'm working currently in a department of data science. And although data science is a thrilling topic, it's not political science. So I'm very happy that you invited me here, and I hope that my talk is indeed inspiring and will lead to some discussion until 4 o'clock. I will talk about feelings or attitudes of political discontent. And for those who didn't hear, my name is Henk van der Kolk, and I have a remote control, but it doesn't work. So every now and then I have to tap here to move the slides. Okay, you probably heard not only in academia, but also in the news about trust, about discontent, and the general feeling is that this trend is going, well, you could say down or up, depending on how you code, of course, your variables. And that is about attitudes towards politics in general. So not attitudes towards a specific politician, or not even at a higher level, attitudes towards democracy, but it's more about the functioning of actual politics. And that trust, that satisfaction is often said to decline. Now, I'm not going to discuss trends. I want to discuss the concept. What do we mean with that? Now, for those that are familiar with the literature, there are a lot of similar variables, all covering the idea of political discontent. Just to name a few: political alienation, which you hardly see in modern literature; internal and mainly external efficacy; political cynicism; stealth democracy, maybe not well known, but also an indication of political discontent; satisfaction with democracy, which may be seen as something more general, not about actual politicians, but about the structures as well; and finally, political trust, combined with rule of law trust. The difference is that trust can be about political parties, about politicians, but also, of course, about judges and others. And these two are not related, at least not strongly, so therefore I mentioned them separately. But all these elements cover ideas of political discontent or political satisfaction, to mention the opposite. And I want to discuss the differences between these concepts. More recently, there was a new kid on the block, which is the word populism, and that's how this project started. Populism can also be seen as an attitude, the attitude that is a contrast between the people and the elite, that the elite is bad, and that the people generally agree and are reasonable, which is called the homogeneity aspect of populism. And therefore, because people think this is the case, they support referenda And of course, populism as an attitude is often used to explain voting for populist parties. Now, there's not just one conceptualization of populism, there are several conceptualizations of populism. Just to mention the three most famous ones, the one is from Ackerman et al., and André is part of that team, that argues that populism is actually one dimension. So one individual trait describing all kinds of individuals. Others, however, have argued that we're talking about related dimensions, which goes partly back to the definition of populism as both anti-elitism and the idea that sovereignty is important, and the idea that the people form a homogeneous group. Now, there are two versions of these, say, dimensional conceptualizations of populism, one by Schulz and one by Da Silva. Now, all these different conceptualizations, of course, pose a problem and a challenge for political scientists. Because if we introduce new concepts, like populism, for example, that reduces the idea of knowledge accumulation. Everything that we have studied in the past decades about alienation, say, is no longer used when we start using the word populism. And the same is true for words like trust as compared to efficacy. If you look at the book, the famous handbook by now by Tom van der Meer, and I forgot the first author, I have to admit, they focus on trust. But if you look in the index, whether they discuss efficacy, there are only 5 or 6 references to that concept. While if you look back to literature from the 80s, it's mainly about efficacy and not about trust. So we also have an emergence of what I call parallel literatures. There is a handbook, you could say, about political efficacy, and another handbook covering more or less the same topics, but then it's called trust. And these are not cross-fertilizing a lot. I mean, of course, there are some connections, but they're often independently developing independently. And I'm afraid that the same will happen with populism. Now, the question that I had is then, are there differences in kinds of political discontents, including populism? And if so, what are these differences and what consequences do they have? Now, in this talk, I will focus mainly on the differences and not so much on the consequences, and why is explained later in this short lecture. So that's my research question, and the research question will be answered in the paper Confusing Discontent: Are populism, political distrust, trust, efficacy and cynicism really so much different? And it will be written by 3 of the 4 people that initiated the project. Now, what I will argue, so I'll tell you the conclusion in the start of my talk, is that the distinctions can be made between some dimensions of discontent, but these discontent dimensions are very, very strongly related. And it thus remains to be seen whether we should stick to using different dimensions of discontent, although they are slightly different. And secondly, I will argue that populism is probably not that different from political discontent. It is merged with some other elements, but once you take that seriously, you could even argue that that merger is only happening to a limited extent, similar to the Schulz operationalization and conceptualization of populism. Now, the structure of this talk is pretty simple. I already introduced the topic and introduced the main research question. I will now move to what we know about differences between these concepts, and also why the knowledge that we seem to have may be of limited relevance, and that is the background of the whole project. How do we properly test the idea of difference between different conceptualizations of discontent? So I'll focus a lot on the design and the data analysis that Matthijs and I currently are doing. And finally, I will show you some outcomes of the analysis, and that will be a bit more nuanced than the summary that I gave in the beginning, but that's basically what I tried to do. Okay, what do we know, and why may most of this knowledge be of limited relevance? Now, first, a few things that I think are really relevant. If you look at a lot of the operationalizations of the measures, like satisfaction in democracy, but also political cynicism, if you take a step back and you think like methodologists, like people in my group are doing, these measures are really, really poor. Satisfaction with democracy is often only one item, so you cannot test the reliability, but also political cynicism is most often measured with only 2 or 3 items. also not really allowing testing the reliability of the operationalization. Secondly, stealth democracy, not internally consistent, cannot be scaled in any way. So, okay, I will ignore that in the remainder of my talk. The internal consistency of various of these composite measures is not always extensively studied. A lot of people report an alpha, but they do not really carefully analyze whether it is really a scale. And the two populism models have been tested, and I have to admit that the groundwork of all three of the operationalizations is really extensive, not only in the published literature, but also in the documents underlying that. But still, I think that needs to be tested more, and especially because there are three different conceptualizations existing alongside each other. And finally, some studies, here it is, yeah, some studies indicate that the dimensions really differ. So that's a very important outcome, especially in the populism literature. You see, we are really doing something relevant because this is different from other indications of political discontent. Now, that's the point that I strongly doubt. And why do I doubt that? Now, Siri is going to help me. Sorry, Siri, shut up. Most of the tests showing that we are really talking about different things is based on secondary data, of course. I mean, we collected a lot of these data, and then we try to test whether the dimensions are really different. However, the items in a lot of our surveys are included as blocks of items. Moreover, these blocks have different scales and different introductions. So it's not strange that the outcome of the analysis then shows that we are dealing with different conceptualizations, different concepts. And secondly, if you have a test with primary data, and some have that, then they are not using random samples. They're using very specialized publics and voluntary participants, etc. So also that test is not really convincing. And that is the background of studying more carefully whether the dimensions of discontent are really different. Now, what is the design of our study? So the study all four of us participated in. We first identified a lot of items, and in the end we came up with 53 political discontent items used in the Dutch parliamentary election study and several other studies. We also reversed a few in order to get the 53, because most of these items are negatively formulated, and we wanted to have a balanced set of items. So, for example, the satisfaction with democracy and the dissatisfaction with democracy were both included in this set. There is an operational overlap between the conceptualizations and operationalizations of the various dimensions. So, for example, what people call compromise in politics is really just selling out one's principles, is both used in operationalizations of populism and in the operationalization of stealth democracy. Moreover, the statement politicians talk too much and take too little action is part of two different operationalizations of populism. So the 53 items cover a large range of different conceptualizations, but items are often used in for measuring different concepts. Now, we needed an incomplete design to test the whole idea. Why is that? There are just too many items for a single questionnaire. You can't ask, at least we think, you can't ask a random sample of individuals 53 of these statements without challenging them too much and without leading to random error somewhere halfway the questionnaire. So we decided to reduce the number of items we could ask to a respondent. Also, we wanted to include a few other items because we also want to see some determinants of discontent and maybe some consequences of discontent. So what was the solution? An incomplete design. Now, that poses a lot of challenges, and that's one of the reasons why this project takes so long. But let me explain the idea of incomplete design first and how you can solve the challenges related to an incomplete design. The idea is as follows. Suppose you have a concept, so here are 4 concepts. You identify a few anchor items that you ask to all groups in your survey. In addition, you make, for example, for group 1, you add a few items for concept 1 and a few items of concept 2. And you do the same for a second group and a third group. This allows us to have a relatively short questionnaire, 32 items, for each of the groups, but you have an incomplete design, meaning not all questions, not all items are posed to all individuals. What you can do is, of course, test the full scale, so the internal consistency of a scale, using only those from group 1. And you can, if you do that, you can compare concept 1 and 2 in the conceptualizations, but only within group 1. So you can do a lot, but you can't do everything. So for example, one of the things Matthijs always was suggesting, just plug it into one big thing and do an exploratory factor analysis to see whether there is a specific underlying dimensionality. But you can't do that because not all items were asked to all individuals. This can be solved by we collected the data with the list panel, so over 4,000 respondents, and we created about 4 groups. So all 4 groups now have 32 items, and these 32 items were all randomly given to individuals. So there were not 4 questionnaires, there was 4 sets of questions that were then given to individuals in a random order. And of course, we excluded a few orders. For example, satisfaction and dissatisfaction with democracy were never in the same block. The same was true for some other combinations, but the rest was randomly assigned to individuals. Okay. Now, since we have an incomplete design, we can solve that in principle with item response theory. We can locate items on scales, and then we do not need all the answers. So incomplete designs can be nicely handled with IRT analysis. However, and that allows us to impute the latent trait. So for example, then we can simply measure political efficacy, political trust, or whatever. You don't necessarily, although you can, we don't impute the scores for specific items, but you can measure the general latent trait that you try to measure. However, this requires an analysis of dimensionality first. So that's what we're doing in the paper. We try to find out what the dimensions are and how they relate to each other. And that's what I will discuss the conclusions of. Okay, so what we did is a confirmatory factor analysis in R, in Lavaan, and we're reporting the various outcome measures thereof. Now, I'm currently struggling with which criteria I have to use for that. So if someone is really well versed in confirmatory factor analysis, help me and help Matthijs tell us. We can improve the paper in that respect. I currently focus on global fit measures only, but I have the feeling that more should be done. Okay, what are the outcomes of this analysis? Well, first of all, the one item operationalization of dissatisfaction with democracy is completely unstable. If we ask, are you satisfied with democracy on a 5-point scale? And are you dissatisfied with democracy? They are hardly related. So 0.5 is the correlation between these items, meaning that if we stick to using the single item operationalization of dissatisfaction with democracy, we have an unreliable indication. Again, stealth democracy, not a scale, ignore that. The Da Silva operationalization of populism, the 3 dimensions that they presented in their article, is not a model. It's not confirmed in confirmatory factor analysis. It does not summarize the data neatly. Trust in political institutions is a good scale. So not with rule of law items and not with political parties. So the very specific one, do you trust political parties? But all the other ones form a nice scale to measure trust. Also, the populism Ackermann is a pretty good scale. It measures populism, at least from a statistical point of view, quite nicely. The populism Schulz model with 3 models is also largely confirmed by the data. The correlations between the 3 dimensions are rather strong, not extremely big, but strong. And I focus mainly on the anti-elite idea, because these are some items that are also included in the Discontent questionnaire, and sovereignty, the idea that the people should decide. The correlation between these 2 is 0.7, but there are definitely different dimensions of, in this case, populism. The homogeneity scale, though, in the Schulz model is really, really poor. The scale as such is not summarizing the data nicely. Okay, the big question, of course, so I now focused on the independent scales that we introduced. Are the scales really different? Are they measuring something which is different? Because of the incomplete design, I can only do partial comparisons. I cannot have one single big model testing all the relationships, but at this stage, I don't think that is necessary. Now, the first outcome, which is really, really strong, is that external political efficacy and political cynicism are actually exactly the same thing. They are nicely summarized by one single trait and together form actually a very good scale. Now, you might argue, is this relevant? Well, still in the Dutch parliamentary election studies, we have external political efficacy measured with 3 items, and political cynicism with 2 items, and one is, I think, with a 4-point scale and the other with a 2-point scale. It really does not make sense to keep on doing that. So I think that's an important outcome. Trust in political institutions is different from political efficacy. So I expected, when I did the analysis, that they were actually the same, but they're not. On the other hand, the correlation between these 2 traits is 0.83. And then you can go back, do we really need 2 concepts that are basically measuring the same thing, although they are indeed a bit different? The populism, Ackermann, and external efficacy are strongly related. They can be seen as one single scale, especially if we tweak it a bit. I'm not going into the tweaking, but it means that populism, at least as operationalized by Ackermann et al., and external efficacy seem to measure more or less the same thing. But that is strange because also the model by Schultz seems to be confirmed by our data. And I hope you still remember, these were 3 different dimensions. Now, what's the thing here? And I have to tell you, I didn't go into details, but Schultz and Ackermann more or less have the same set of items. Some of the items are the same. So how come that we can both argue that Ackermann populism is one scale and also strongly coinciding with external efficacy, while at the same time we argue that the Schultz model with 3 dimensions is also a good summary of the data? And that's the big, or at least one of the puzzles that we try to solve. If you look very carefully, you can see that there are actually only 2 sovereignty items, the idea that the public should decide in the Ackermann scale. And if you have only 2 of these items, they quickly go to the rest. So they merge with the remainder, which is mainly anti-elitism. But in the Schultz operationalization, there are more sovereignty items. So then they separate, they separate from the discontent external efficacy element. Okay, so what's the overall conclusion? There is a measurable trait, political discontent, trust. There are some subtle differences, meaning that trust is indeed a bit different from external efficacy, but we have to discuss in the future whether we still want to stick to different operationalizations of probably more or less largely the same thing. This is about populism. The populism trait is what I think mainly discontent associated with something else. And I think that that summarizes more nicely what you find in the data. It is the feeling that the old feeling, the feeling that we studied over decades under different names, the feeling that the elite is a bad group of people, but it's associated with, more recently, with the idea, Siri, shut up. I didn't say Siri. It's more or less recently associated with the idea that this problem can be solved by more popular sovereignty. And that may be an outcome, a consequence of political parties stressing that idea. I think that what has changed in the past is that feeling of discontent that exists for over 40, 50 years and has been studied for that period is now politicized and associated with the idea that there is a solution for that problem, and that is done by political parties. So therefore, you nowadays see that old idea of political discontent became associated, which it wasn't, nowadays is associated with the idea that the sovereign people, more people sovereignty will solve that very problem. Okay, that was 20 minutes, I think. I like to stick within my time frame, and that was my talk. I hope it leads to discussion.
Thank you, Henk. This was great. Those of you who are new here today, you can type a question to Henk in the Q&A box, and then I will read it out, and Henk can respond. Matthijs also joined. He is there for the difficult methodological questions, he informed us. And the people in the room with Gijs obviously don't have to type their questions, but can communicate via Gijs that they want to ask a question. So we're going to try a little bit how that works with the sound, because that is a bit of a challenge that we have, right, or that we're learning in this hybrid environment. So while people might be thinking about their questions, I will take the opportunity to ask the first question, Henk. And I want to thank you and compliment you for doing this, because I guess we're also always telling our students that measurement is important, but on the other hand, we're also always all too eager to explain phenomena and not focus too much on measurement. So these particular concepts have always sparked some interest among myself. So I'm happy that you're critically evaluating it. And so the question I have for you is, so right now you're trying to understand to what extent there is a one latent concept or multiple latent concepts. And I think that you could say, well, are these things basically the same thing? We would say convergent validity. But I was wondering, is the logical next step of this project not to look at the predictive validity of these concepts? And the list panel would really be suitable for that, because you have basically everything in there. So my question is, what would you then expect when it comes to the predictive validity? It's just like, well, basically all these things predict the same. So what are your expectations in terms of the predictive validity here?
Well, basically, you're discussing the last section of the paper, which I skipped. But you're right. Indeed, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. To what extent do the various conceptualizations explain things? Now, for the paper, we decided to focus on populist voting. And we basically argue that you can explain populist voting as good with the ordinary political efficacy scale, in which form, whatever, or the populism scale. So both can be used for more or less the same thing, and therefore you do not necessarily need the populism. What we are still trying to find out is whether that sovereignty aspect, which is slightly independent from the anti-elitism aspect, has an additional effect on populist voting. So that's the aim of the paper. Yeah, I don't have, by the way, the results yet of that. So we're still struggling with how to do this without first constructing a scale and then doing a regression analysis. We want to do it all in one with a SEM model. And well, that is something of a struggle. But yes.
Okay, let's try this hybrid thing. I've been told that Tom has a question as well. So Tom, the microphone has to be turned on. Yes.
Hi, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Hi,
okay.
Tom.
Hi, how are you? First of all, douze point. I really like what you're presenting here. I think one of the main response that you'll get from reviewers will be that all these different concepts, they have different theoretical backgrounds, and that a lot of the value of these different concepts will be in that. So political trust is based on the idea of vulnerability, populism not so much. So that will be something that I think you should keep in mind. But we're talking about measures here and measurement models. One has already been covered, one of my questions has been covered by Bert, but trust, as you model it now in factor analysis, is one way to model the scale of trust. But quite a few recent studies suggest that trust is hierarchical. At least this trust battery is an hierarchical scale, where trust in the justice system is almost a precursor to trust government and parliament, and that's a precursor to be able to trust parties. You didn't delve into that, but that might be a different explanation why some of the items drop out of the analysis in your case. The second question that I have is, you mentioned the single scale of efficacy and cynicism. Now, we were both involved in the Dutch parliamentary election survey a few years ago, and we had to keep these items in because of the old people who didn't want to change anything to the survey. But we also know that cynicism in the Dutch Parliament Interaction Survey is very weakly related to the concept of cynicism itself. It isn't a measure of cynicism to quite a few people, it's a measure of realism. When I worked with Paul Decker, we did some quantitative interviews, and the people that we interviewed that scored high on this value weren't cynical, they were realist. Sure, people do not care about people like me. My voice isn't being heard. It matters who you know to get into public, stuff like that. So the problem might not so much be in terms of the concept, but in terms of very weak measures that you describe. How will you pull that apart?
Yeah, thank you for the questions. Matthijs, write down the hierarchical thing. I didn't think about that. That may be a solution indeed for the finding of three different factors when it comes to trust. So I'm not going into that. Very good point. The other 2 points are actually related. When you defend the cynicism items, and also when you point to different theoretical backgrounds of operationalizations, I think you're making the same argument, which is that theory and interpretation steers us in a specific direction in interpreting the items. And the more I analyze the data, the more I come to disagree with that basic idea. You see that also in the discussion of populism. You see a lot of theoretical argumentation discussing why we should measure or include things in a very specific way. You read sentences like, this is not populism. Okay, so a very, very, how do you say that? Realistic way of looking at, no, that's not the word. You define a concept by looking at the theoretical background, and then you argue it has to be different. I don't think that that is the way we should proceed. I mean, what we see in the data is that statements about politicians don't care about my opinion, they're only interested in my vote, which you can at least, you can interpret that as a realist statement, but it's strongly associated with these are buggers, these are bad people. So empirically, they are associated. So I care less about the fact that the first one is realistic because we are political scientists and we know it's true. I care more about, is it empirically measuring something that we think is important? I hope that is a counter argument.
Thanks, Henk. We're going to...
Maybe Tom doesn't agree.
Yeah, but let's first because then we have some time for, if there's more time, then we'll allow for extensive deliberation. Because there's also a question from Emily Miltenburg, and I'll read it out. You can actually follow it if you press on this Q&A box.
So it's not in the chat.
No, it's in the Q&A, which is next to the chat.
Oh, here, there's a different one.
Yeah,
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So the question is this. Thank you so much for your clear presentation. If I understood it correctly, you also included some items in the survey on the causes and consequences of political discontent. At the SCP, Sociaal en Cultureel Planbureau, we are starting a project on this in relationship with societal unease or societal pessimism and the roots of this political and societal discontent. Can you say something more about your plans about studying the causes of discontent?
I have to admit that we currently focused in the paper only on the consequences. Did we discuss causes? Matthijs, did we?
Well, not really for the papers, but what is interesting is that we actually included some of the questions about societal pessimism in our survey. Yeah. These were the filler questions, and those were some of the questions that Evje has asked, I think, in her research, and I think we included like 3 of them or something. So we could study it, but we haven't done so yet. But it is that one is in our survey, and we can of course look at many different other possible causes. But this was something that was just not on our agenda yet, no. Right?
But we already mentioned it's the list panel. So basically all possible explanations of discontent and possible consequences of discontent have been included at some point in the list panel. So we can do a lot. Since our study covers, well, 4,000 individuals. Most smaller studies are within our study. So not all, but most variables have been studied in the rest of the list panel. We even have, for example, the possibility to study the overtime stability of the populism scale, because the populism scale was also included 2 or 3 times already in the list panel, and it shows a huge stability over time. So that is, yeah. So we can do it, but we didn't do it yet.
Great, thanks. Let's switch back to Amsterdam, where Wouter van der Brug has a question.
Yes, thanks very much for the presentation, Henk. It's really fascinating, and I really enjoyed listening to it. It makes me very curious, because many of the results, you described the results, but you didn't really show them. So, and that makes me very curious sometimes. Okay, well, what does this really mean? For instance, when you say we have 2 scales, and it turns out that they measure something different, yep, but the correlation is 0.83 or something. Yep. What exactly does that mean?
I can explain what we did.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. We did a confirmatory factor analysis, and then you can estimate the model. Is it 1 scale? And you can estimate the model. Is it 2 scales, 2 related scales? And you can test whether 1 scale fits the data better than the other. You have a formal test for that. It's an ANOVA test. And what I presented here is just the outcome of that test, showing that, yes, indeed, the 2-dimensional one in which the 2 dimensions are correlated is better than a 1-dimensional scale in which all the items form 1 latent trait. So that is the outcome of the analysis.
But would, in that case, for instance, a 1-dimensional solution still fit the data good enough to have an acceptable fit?
According to the standard cutoff points, say, what is it, the CFA of 0.95, of 95, etc. No, then it would not be a good fit. But that's one of the things that I learned about confirmatory factor analysis. It very much depends on where you look at, because sometimes you see indeed that both interpretations seem to be correct, but still one is significantly better than the other. And then, okay, what do you choose? But you're right. In this case, though, when it comes to cynicism and the other one, it's really much better to have 1 single scale. With the trust and efficacy difference, it really did not fit to have 1 single scale, and also 2 scales was significantly better than the other and was a good model of the data.
Yeah, but I mean, my argument would be that confirmatory factor analysis is really not the model to use here, because it's so sensitive to different distributions of the different variables that you use, that they start loading on different scales, and you get a much better fit when they're loading on different scales. So, for instance, the argument that Tom just made on the hierarchy in the trust items, an item response theory based model would pick that up. Whereas in a factor analysis, they would start loading on different latent dimensions if the distribution is really different. Yeah, I can also show you.
I understand the point.
Yeah.
But the thing is that when we started writing the paper, we wrote an IRT paper. We did the IRT analysis, but then I found out that you can only do that in an accessible way if you first discuss the dimensionality. Because IRT analysis assumes that you know the dimensionality.
And then it tests whether all of the items measure that latent trait.
Yeah, true. Okay, so we come back
So
to
if that's rejected or some items are thrown out, then obviously they don't fit that one-dimensional structure.
I agree. So what would you recommend? Because Matthijs and I have been struggling with the paper for quite some time. The previous version, as I said, was largely based on IRT analysis. And then or at least, yeah, all the analysis, we arrived at a conclusion, we better do a confirmatory factor analysis first, and then redo part of the analysis using IRT analysis. But I am now suggesting to abandon that idea and to go back to IRT analysis first?
Well, if
We'll do it both.
if confirmatory factor analysis shows or sort of supports the idea that there's a unidimensional structure, then I would trust that. But once it says, well, you need, or you get a much better fit if you have 2 dimensions, then I don't know whether that is because the 2 latent dimensions are conceptually different, or whether the distribution of the items that are intended to measure the 2 latent dimensions are different. And that's a problem in exploratory factor analysis more than in confirmatory, but also in confirmatory factor analysis, it's a big problem.
Okay.
I think, sorry. Yeah.
I get the point. Can we solve this by writing the paper like we did it now, like I presented it now, but then ending with, okay, we argue that CFA gave us different dimensions. However, and then we can give your argument saying that this still doesn't mean that this is the simplest interpretation of the data. We can maybe find a simpler interpretation using IRT analysis where they're actually that it is actually 1 dimension.
But is that what basically the IRT models show, that it is 1 dimension or not? Or are many items thrown out?
Not all of them, but at least we can, in the paper, we can end with saying, okay, we will study that in the next paper. We can't exclude the possibility that it is still 1 dimension. But the point is, of course, the starting point is that we started with a lot of different scales. Mm-hmm. And the main conclusion is, of course, well, maybe we should not stress the difference between all these different concepts too much, because basically they are either strongly related or form a single scale. And what you are now trying to argue is that it is even worse. It's even less different than we already showed.
I'm not sure because I
no,
seen
but
the
it can
analysis,
be.
but it can be. Yeah.
Henk, I'm gonna intervene for a second because I at least know that Philip Mendoza, who is also in the room, still has a question, so that we make sure that we cover that before we can continue the exchange on IRT versus CFA, which is very interesting. So Philip, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me well? I'm all the way in the back. Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Henk, for the really interesting presentation. I really like the data collection part of how these constructs might have established themselves as independent constructs just by mere means of collecting them differently. But I actually have a question about the generalizability or your thoughts on how these findings might translate to different contexts, different times, because you've already mentioned how the populism attitude, scale or so might have aligned itself with this political efficacy one over time, which is a very interesting thought. And I was wondering whether this might also be the case with other dimensions, that this sort of convergence might only be unique to the Netherlands now in time. Yeah, what are your thoughts on this?
Now I have to go beyond the paper. I mean, the paper is 1 single survey, 1 moment in time, 1 context. So I can't test ideas about changes in the dimensionality. But you're right, while writing the paper, more and more I came to think of, to what extent do we actually think that there is a more or less latent trait called discontent, and is the dimensionality stable, and is the position of an individual stable on that dimension? I mean, these are 2 different things, and I'm not sure. I mean, we first need to disentangle both ideas. I mean, people can become more discontent and less discontent over time, but they can also have combine different ideas about discontent in different ways over time. And these things are different indeed. So I can reflect on that, but the data do not allow me to really test these ideas. Am I now willing and able to say interesting things that you can reflect on?
Maybe I can say something.
Oh, sorry.
Well, no.
Go ahead.
Slightly related. What is interesting, of course, is if indeed we conclude in the end that populism is basically external efficacy plus, right? Plus something which is sovereignty, that is the new sauce over the efficacy concept. That would be then it would be very interesting, because that could mean, if that's the case, it could mean that we can use efficacy variables to use as a proxy for populism to some extent. And it means that we can go further back in time and use efficacy as a proxy for populist attitudes. And that would be, of course, I mean, it's still way too early to conclude that, but if this is the conclusion we draw, that might be a very interesting future path to take, basically.
Yeah, good point.
Matthijs, before I return to a question from the audience. So my question is, quick question for you. What does this now mean for the scholarship on populism? Because you can think about what it means for measuring populism, but what is it? So are we right for the wrong reasons? Or are we studying a concept that, are we just relabeling something at the individual level? So what are your reflections on this?
I personally, but I
go ahead. Go ahead. I go second.
I go for, okay. Then contradict me, please. Okay, you say the opposite of what I say. I am more and more convinced that we should not aim for a new conceptualization called populism to measure something at an individual level. So I do not think that we should aim for a better operationalization, better set of items, etc., what Ackerman, Schulz, and Da Silva tried to do. I think we should go in the direction of measuring discontent in a good way, and hopefully in the same way or similar way, or at least connected to the way we studied that in the past decades. And then in addition to that, reflect on ideas that became associated with that discontent. That there are sovereignty solutions, so referenda, and the people should have a say, and politicians should listen to individuals, that became attached to that. And I think that that is another way of looking at this topic. So instead of looking for one dimension or a three-dimensional model, which is really different, see it as an extension of what is done in the trust literature and in the political efficacy literature, and extend that with the new ideas that came up in the context of populism. I think that would be my answer to your question.
Yeah, and I would add to that of course it's about bundling anti-elitism or external efficacy or cynicism or discontent, however you call it, with sovereignty, right? So it's about how you combine the two. And we have these findings in the Netherlands, which are really interesting, but of course, it might well be the case that before or later or in other countries, the combination of the two or the bundling of the two is different, because, for instance, politicians combine them in different ways, or because people think about these things differently. I don't know, but therefore I think it's also interesting what Philip asked. It's very important to also later on test this in other countries, because the fact that we talk about bundling means that it's really necessary to also focus on different contexts where this bundling can be done differently by parties, by other types of elites, for instance.
Yeah, great, thanks.
So that was not really contradicting, but extending the idea.
Extending,
yeah. Okay, so we agree.
But I never contradict you.
Supporting co-authors, that's great. Okay, so the next question is from Sjors Overman, who is somewhere in the room.
Yes, it's me. Thank you. Thanks for this very interesting work and for presenting it. I'm not really a political scientist, so I might be less burdened by actual knowledge about this topic. But in the vein of the discussion that was just exchanged, I'm not really convinced by measurement alone. Like, I think correlation does not equal causation. I also think that loading on a single dimension does not equal being the same thing. So I would be much more convinced if you could relate them to other variables, especially if it's based on sound theory, so that you might have certain scales that relates to another variable or correlate with another variable, but maybe another configuration does not. In that case, that would argue maybe for a more dimensional and also theoretically more dimensional concept rather than a unidimensional concept. So long story short, I think that this measurement should always go hand in hand with theoretical conceptualization.
I fully agree. A first step in every confirmatory factor analysis is always first discuss the content of the items. In this case, however, I think that trust, efficacy, etc., have all been theorized quite extensively as a relationship between the respondent towards a set of politicians, and it's done in slightly different ways, but all the items have been defended in that way. So I'm not so much afraid that we are putting very different items on one single heap only because they load on the same factor. All these items have been defended at one point in time in history as indications of that general idea of we are unhappy with them. I think that would be my answer to your question. It's not simply, I mean, the selection of items is based on what was used up until now in the literature. So they have been theoretically defended.
Good. Okay, thanks. Tom, you have a follow-up question, maybe on your earlier question, or?
No, I have quite a few follow-ups now, but the argument.
Well, in the interest of time, keep it to one. I know,
but the argument that Henk just made, you're right. I mean, it's in trust, it's A trusts B, and that's where the discontent is. But it goes a lot further. I mean, the discontent is directed to something, not just to an object, but to a situation, to an activity, etc. And that's why they might still differ quite a bit. That was my follow-up, but I think by focusing too much on discontent itself, you might lose all these sometimes quite relevant analysis. But what I want to follow up on is the longitudinal idea. I think you can do more using the list panel data, where the Dutch Dutch Parliamentary Election Survey was included a few times. So you've got the trust battery, you've got the cynicism battery, the efficacy battery, your populism scales, so you can do a lot more. And I agree that over time, the dimensionality tends to be quite stable. But these items, they do differ in terms of the positions that people take, at least at the aggregate, but also at the individual level, where trust, for instance, is much more volatile, political trust is. Other elements, such as cynicism and to a lesser extent efficacy, are much less volatile. In fact, they tend to trend stable or in the direction of less discontent. And that is another reason why you should still try to distinguish between these different objects, because we need to understand, even though the dimensional structure might be too much of an overlap, why the positions that people take on those dimensional structures might differ with time.
Okay, there are two comments. First about the theorizing. I really, and I said it before, I became convinced that we sometimes theorize too much because we expect that the very subtle distinctions we make about relationships between actors and politicians are also made by the respondents. And I don't believe that. If I talk to the people in my skating club about politics, they don't make these subtle distinctions. So they respond to questions like this in a much more general way. And although we can theoretically argue that they're different, empirically they're not, because that's not how people look at politics. So that is, I really think we overestimate in that sense, but only in that sense, the relevance of theorizing. Your second point is more a suggestion, which I very much agree on. That is, have a look at the list panel and check whether the stability, we checked it for populism, and I already said the correlation between the scale score in our study and the previous one was 0.9 or even more than that. So the scale score, not at the items, but the general, which is, I think, huge. We didn't do it for the other ones yet, but that's indeed a very good suggestion. So maybe we can write a paper about individual level stability, and then your hypothesis that some of the scales maybe show more stability than others seem to test. So thank you for the suggestion, or maybe someone else can do it, but yeah, that's a very good idea.
And what is interesting, I think, is that that we do find that the trust items differ from efficacy and cynicism and populism to some extent. They do seem to, and we expected that it would also be like just a measure of discontent. That was one of our expectations maybe in the beginning, but it turned out that it is something different to some extent, right? It's always the question, when is it really something different? Because that is what we have been struggling with, but it is more different from the rest than the other concepts are.
And this may be because what Tom said is that one is more stable than the other. Then that may be reflected in finding two different dimensions. I mean, not literally, of course, because you measure it only at one point in time. But if trust is indeed less stable than efficacy, you could say trust is basically efficacy plus something more volatile, which makes it then in the end more volatile, but also slightly different from efficacy. So that could be a direction we can take in the analysis.
If you look at the measures, that makes sense, because I'm a trust scholar, but these are the worst items imaginable. They are completely empty. To what extent do you trust government?
Yeah.
You don't define anything.
Yeah.
You leave everything up to the respondent to interpret.
Yeah.
So that's why this is likely interpretation.
Yeah. Okay. But that is in line with. But that's in line with the interpretation. That is, the trust items are more volatile because they're bad items.
They're worse items.
Yeah. There's still a quick question from Eefje, I think. Yeah. Eefje, if you can do it short, and then also a short answer from Henk.
No, I can't, but I'll try. So one thing I wanted to ask, but you just answered it, is what the outcome was actually about how similar is trust to all the other attitudes, and what the final conclusions in the presentation were about the populism scale. And then you talked about, consequences in terms of voting for populist parties. I think that is the less exciting part of your study, actually, because I think the trust items, just what Tom said, are very unclear and vague, and to show the level of similarity between those items and the more focused efficacy or populist items, and then the similarity, the shared variation, and what that does in terms of behavior. I think that is the most exciting part that I would be interested in. And another thing I would like to see more about is that you say that you find an item survey with 50 questions on this topic too challenging, which I totally agree. And then you have 32 questions or something. So I was wondering, how did you decide on that? And do you control in any way about like how far in the survey the question comes, or to control for that? And
okay,
I'm really
short
really short
last issue first. The decision 32 was like that. And the way we solved it was having small blocks intermittent with questions about other topics. So that's what Matthijs already mentioned. So that's how we broke up, I think, to 4 randomly created blocks. So there's not a block in that sense, but say first 8 questions, then some other questions, 8 questions, other questions, 8 questions. So that's how we build up the questionnaire. Why like that? That was, we don't know, but we think this is doable. So that's the second one. The first one, only a short defense. This whole project started with me complaining about yet another concept, which is populism. So that's why populism is still there. And I'm happy to see that it is more broadly relevant. So yeah, maybe we can think about that. Short answer.
Okay,
Yes, thanks.
great. Thanks a lot, Henk, for these great answers and the great presentation. Also, I want to thank your assistant, Matthijs. He did really well today. And Matthijs already has the infamous Hot Politics Lab coffee mug, but Henk, you, of course, as presenter in our lab, will also receive one in due time.
Great. I lost mine. So I would like to have yours.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to replace that again. That's really, that's really you. Okay, we have a very exciting schedule in the next coming weeks that I want to invite everyone to. Next week, same time, same place. Well, places here and online. We have Hugo Mercier from Paris giving a talk that is titled "Not Born Yesterday: Why Humans Are Less Gullible Than We Think." Again, I guess really a story about very similar attitudes that have been discussed today, but then from a evolutionary psychology perspective. Then October 15, we have Christopher Lucas with a talk, More Than Words, How Political Rhetoric Shapes Voters' Effect and Evaluation. And then we have October 22, Graduate Friday, with 2 presentations by Isabella Rebasso and Leonard Schurman. And then the end of the month, October 29, we have Ellen Sanfi, a major name in neuroscience, who will give a presentation on political neuroscience. So I'm very excited to have seen you all today. And for those of you who are here physically or online, but in the neighborhood, you're welcome to have a drink with us in a Crea Cafe at the expense of the European Union. Hope to see you next week.
Bye.